latest podcast, the Heidelminicast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Are ministers qualified to set bones? Are they qualified to give advice about how to fix your car? What are the limits to the knowledge of ministers?
If the Heidelcast helps you, or you help us keep it going, please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Island Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
One of my favorite podcasts is Car Talk, featuring Tom and Ray Magliozzi. And Tom is no longer with us. He died in 2014, and the show is not obviously being broadcast now, but for years and years, it was broadcast on NPR. I think, looking at the Wikipedia page, and regular listeners and readers know what I think about Wikipedia.
Sabotucci's, Column 5, spies!
Not always a very reliable source of information.
Is everybody dumb?
No, but there's a lot of dumb stuff on Wikipedia. But anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole again. But anyway, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page because, the way the internet is set up, it's the first thing that comes up, and I'm being lazy. I was just trying to make sure I had the date of Tom's passing. He was born in 1937. As I say, died in 2014. And I think they were a local show in Boston before they became a national show. But in 1987, they became a national show. And it was a huge hit. So they were in the movies. They had a TV show for a while. They had a cartoon on television for a while. But their main gig, besides running a garage in Boston, was a Saturday radio show in which they took calls in a way that's not entirely clear to me. I've read different things over the years about how they did that, because I don't think they took calls live exactly. I don't know how they did it. At any rate, they took calls and answered questions, and it's a lot of fun. A couple of brothers who were separated by a number of years. Tom was quite a bit older than Ray, who I think was maybe the baby of the family. And they had a great sense of humor, and it was an oasis of sanity on national public radio. So, which in my view should be defunded. But anyway, that would get us into an even deeper rabbit hole. So I was listening to it's podcasted now. You can get it on Apple Podcasts or wherever. That's where I get it. They will let you listen to 2 a week, and then if you pay extra, you can listen to all of them. I don't know how much it is, $2.50 a week or $2.50 a month. I don't know what it is. At any rate, it's a great show. Obviously, some of the cars they're discussing now are pretty old, but some of this stuff is pretty timeless. And recently, they broadcast an episode in which they took a call from a woman who had a 1957 Metropolitan who had an issue with her gas tank or something, and the car was stalling.
I have a 1957 Metropolitan.
Oh,
no kidding.
Really?
I just love. It's a car that I'm absolutely in love with.
What a car.
It is. It's just beautiful.
Awesome.
But I have a big mechanical problem. And though he's a great body man, he's no mechanic.
Ah.
And he put a new motor in it, and ever since he put the new motor in it, every time I drive it, it stalls. And it stalled twice on me, and I got really upset about it. And it was raining really hard, and he said that the reason why it stalled was because it was raining really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't seem to make sense. I was in Pittsfield, which is just a little ways from Heartland, and it stalled, and I pulled over to the side of the road, and a man came along, and he told me he used to have a Metropolitan, and what was the problem? And I said, well, I don't know, but it just stalled. So I was a little nervous about getting out of the car and talking to him, and he told me he was a minister. So because he said he was a minister, I believed him.
Sure.
So I can hear giggling.
No.
You can certainly trust a man of the cloth.
And he had a wife in the car, so I felt a lot more comfortable.
You're all right.
So we went around the back of my Metro, and he blew in the gas tank. And he told me to get back up front and turn the key, and it started right up when he blew in the gas tank. And so I drove it back to Heartland, told my husband what happened, and he said that had nothing to do with anything on it. It was damp, and that's why it wouldn't go on its own. So I went back to my husband's shop, and he said that I couldn't possibly blow hard enough in the gas tank for it to make a difference.
He's right about that.
And you can test this theory by just taking off the cap next time it stalls. Mm-hmm. And just all you have to do is unscrew it and then screw it right back on again and see if it starts right up. And if it does, then that's it.
Pretty good, huh?
God, I hate to think that he might have been right all along.
Who might have been right?
My husband saying that it didn't make any difference to blow.
Well, it doesn't make any difference. You probably couldn't blow into that thing hard enough to make a difference.
Yeah, the guy, the minister, he had his head up his keister. I mean,
well, almost made a Christian out of me.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Well, that caught my attention for a couple of reasons. One, I'd never seen a 1957 Metropolitan, so that's kind of interesting. But second, it caught my attention because, ministers don't get discussed, in public very often. And so I thought that caught my attention. The only religious figures that get any positive press these days are Roman Catholic priests. You see occasional positive portrayals of Muslim imams and rabbis, but ministers have largely disappeared from public. It's interesting, I watch old movies because so much of modern television is so stupid. It just is. I mean, there's a lot of there's good television out there. I know that, and we've cut the cord, and we're subscribed to a bunch of different services now, and so we see what's out there. There's some good stuff, but ministers have basically disappeared. But if you watch older movies, ministers used to appear pretty regularly, and not always, and maybe not even regularly, as comic figures. They appear as reasonable people. So I think it just reflects the status of Protestant ministers generally, the status of the mainline churches to some degree, because they've largely, in their attempt to remain relevant by being hip with it, the church of what's happening now, they've basically lost their place in society. Rather than if they just kept doing what they were called to do, preach the law and the gospel, teach the Christian faith faithfully, maybe they might still be somewhat relevant. But because they've given all that up in favor of doing other things, issuing policy statements, the PCUSA has published something like 127 policy statements. And I keep telling my politically, theologically conservative friends, I'm politically probably to the right of Genghis Khan, according to some people, but and theologically, I'm very, very conservative, so I'm not juxtaposing myself with them. But I have, politically, theologically conservative friends who think that the churches, conservative churches, should be issuing policy statements, and they think that they can do it and get away with it. Never mind what happened to the PCUSA. And before that, the Southern Presbyterian Church, well, both of them simultaneously, I guess. But now today, the PCUSA, since they're merged, never mind what happened to the mainline churches. But it's the right people. It's the theory that the right people haven't tried it. And so if the right people do it, no pun intended, the correct people do it, so I mean, then that'll be okay if we turn the church into an agency issuing social statements. That'll be different this time because, I don't know, magic?
He's talking pig Latin. I don't know what he's saying. Truth is stranger than fiction.
Well,
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
that's probably a good idea. What does he know? Anyway, so as I listened to this segment on Car Talk, from what year I don't even know, I thought of my old friend Norman Hofflinger, known affectionately to his friends as Nub Hoflinger. He was a minister in the Reformed Church in the United States, where I served for a number of years. And Nub was a 1955 graduate of Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, and he was a board member at WTS, and was in our little NAPARC world relatively well known. He was helped in the early days of the formation of NAPARC, North American Presbyterian and Reformed Council, and he was a well-regarded minister in the Reformed Church in the United States. And when I really got to know him, he was sort of the senior statesman, because I had met him before I served with him, but we served together in Kansas City for a couple of years, from 1987 to 89 or 90 or so, when he took a call to Mitchell, South Dakota. Anyway, Norman told me stories about the old days when he entered ministry in 1955, and I don't remember. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out where, and I guess I could have dug up minutes from the RCUS Eureka classes and figured out where he was sent, but he was sent somewhere in the Dakotas, or got a call somewhere in the Dakotas in 1955, where he preached in German for a couple of years when he first got out of seminary. So fortunately, Norman was multilingual, and it was a tiny little village. They didn't have phones yet in the houses. There was a phone, as he told the story, as I remember it anyway. This memory goes back to 1987, I guess. He would get a phone call from Philadelphia, and he'd have to put on his shoes and go down to the one phone in the village to take a long-distance phone call from Philadelphia, which was a big deal in this little village, somewhere in the Dakotas. I don't know if it was north or south or where it was. At any rate, one of the things he told me was that before he got there, some of the old ministers, particularly among the Germans, would set bones. They practiced medicine in the Dakotas. So this is all relevant to the contemporary discussion we're having about John MacArthur and whether ministers can make pronouncements about psychiatry, mental illness, and medication. I remember Norman being fairly astounded, as I was, at the thought of ministers who have, we hope, a sort of a liberal arts education, a bachelor's degree in the arts of some kind, or maybe in the sciences. That happens. And then a theological degree. In the old days, they earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree. Everybody didn't have a master's degree back then. What happened was in the 1970s, the baby boomers were graduating with bachelor's degrees, and they went off to seminary, and all their friends who were dodging the draft were going off to grad school and getting master's degrees, and then some of them going on to get PhDs, and you see what's happened to the university since then. All their friends were getting master's degrees, and so the boomers who were in seminary said, hey, we have a bachelor's degree, we want a master's degree. And the seminaries essentially capitulated to the boomers and decreed magically that your bachelor's of divinity degree, if you want it to be, is now a master's degree. Send in your bachelor's diploma with the signatures of the esteemed faculty members, and we will send you back a master's diploma with the signatures of the current faculty. And some did and some didn't, but that's how that happened. Traditionally, though, people took theology in the university, in the university faculty, and then depending on what university they attended, they might earn a master's degree, or in some cases, their bachelor's degree would simply mature. If you behaved yourself for a couple of years, it would mature automatically into an MA, a Master of Arts degree. So that's how that used to work. And then it used to be that the Bachelor of Divinity degree was actually one of the more difficult degrees. And not everybody went on to earn a BD. You just graduated with theological education as part of your BA and maybe earned an MA. In more recent time, there was a reaction against professionalization and the idea that ministers didn't know anything other than the law and the gospel. in the Articles of the Christian Faith. Jay Adams led that revolt in the 1970s. In particular, he published, I guess most famously, Competent to Counsel, in which he encouraged pastors to take up pastoral counseling and to apply to their people the categories of Christian theology. And he published a lot of critiques of the various psychological schools of thought, Freudianism and Rogerian psychotherapy and Jungian approaches to psychotherapy and so forth. And all of that was, or much of that one anyway, was very helpful. And it was a sort of a clarion call for pastors to re-engage with their people in the counseling office. But it produced a notion in a lot of circles, particularly in fundamentalist circles, who were sort of attracted to the nouthetic counseling model. And you can see now that it's mostly fundamentalists who dominate the nouthetic counseling world, despite the attempts of David Howlinson and the folks at least what I used to know as CCEF, Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation, to sort of mature the nouthetic model. And I think they did a good job. And I think it's unfortunate that maybe some of their work has been neglected or overlooked. But at any rate, Jay's attempt to sort of get pastors to re-engage with their people and to counsel them. And I think he probably went too far in some instances and gave the impression anyway, I don't know that he practiced himself this way, but gave people the impression that pastors were omnicompetent, that if you read all of Jay's books, that you really didn't need to rely on counselors who were not ministers, who are not theologically educated, certainly didn't need to rely on quote-unquote secular counselors, and you didn't need to rely on psychiatrists. And as I've said before about MacArthur and his comments in a recent episode on the Heidelcast, there is a sense in which I think psychiatrists have, as physicians, are trained to do in the modern period. They tend to regard human beings as machines, and they tend to be materialistic. Sometimes they're Freudian, and sometimes they're Jungian. And I assume there are still Rogerians out there. There are probably other approaches now. But in my experience, they've tended to rely on the prescription pad rather than, other approaches. And when I've dealt with people, I've cooperated sometimes with counselors, psychologists, as distinct from psychiatrists. Psychologists aren't physicians. Psychiatrists are physicians. Maybe there are physicians who become psychologists. I don't know. But typically, a psychiatrist is a physician, somebody with a medical degree and the right to write psychiatric prescriptions. So they have tended, in my experience in reading, to rely heavily on the prescription pad.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
But there are better and worse psychiatrists, and ministers are not omnicompetent. And as a consequence of the nouthetic movement and of its appropriation in fundamentalist quarters, I think some fellows have come to think of themselves as able to opine on all things, which is why I thought that bit from Tom and Ray was kind of interesting, because the minister was wrong. It isn't the case that blowing into the gas tank does anything. As Tom and Ray said, it's likely the case that taking off the gas cap introduced air, oxygen particularly, into the gas tank, and which needed to happen, and released the pressure, changed the dynamic within the gas tank and allowed it to function better so that the car didn't stall. But the reason it was stalling is because the old gas caps had worn out and they'd been replaced with modern gas caps rather than with the correct gas caps. And so the minister had, for whatever reason, had decided to experiment with.
Oh, stop that double talk. I want to hear the Lone Ranger.
Blowing into his gas tank. I don't know what made him think that might be useful. And then he drew a fallacious conclusion. All right. Coincidence or correlation is not causation.
Is everybody dumb?
It happens to all of us. We're all tempted to draw fallacious conclusions. But it's not the case that if blowing into gas tank and then the car starts or runs because blowing into gas tank. What caused the car to operate correctly for a little while anyway was just taking the gas cap off. So the minister strayed outside his area of expertise. So let's just assume he's an Orthodox pastor, believe the Bible, believe the historic Christian faith. What are his areas of competence? Well, he knows the Apostles' Creed, knows the Articles of the Undoubted Holy Catholic Christian Faith, lowercase c on Catholic. And let's say he's a Reformed minister. Let's say he's a confessional Reformed minister and he subscribes the Westminster Standards or the Three Forms of Unity, or maybe he's one of those rare birds who subscribes all of what I sometimes call the six forms of unity, the Belgian Confession, the Canons of Dort, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Westminster Standards. Does that give him competence in physics? Well, maybe if he did an undergraduate degree in physics, or maybe did advanced work in physics. So, I mean, if a minister has specialized training in an area, then he might have some competence. I knew a pastor who had been, his memory serves, I think he had been an anesthesiologist and had performed surgery or been in the surgical theater with, again, I'm just going from memory, with Michael DeBakey working on, early heart transplant surgery. So he had competence, to be sure, in medical areas that most ministers wouldn't have. Now, I don't know that he was giving medical advice. One of the things I was taught as a young pastor or as a seminary student from Dr. Dirk Bergsma, or by Dr. Dirk Bergsma, the Reverend Dr. Dirk Bergsma of blessed memory was, basically, he didn't use these words, but he essentially taught us to stay in our lane, resist the temptation, he said, to give medical advice. And I always tried to adhere to that because I am now a PhD or a D.Phil, so I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher. That's what that means. That's all Latin means. It kills me when physicians say, "You're not a doctor." Well, actually, I am. As Bob Godfrey's, one of Bob's sons, said years ago, not the kind who can do anybody any good. Medically, that is.
Is everybody done?
No. Not the kind who could do anybody any good medically. But I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a physician. It's not my business to be giving medical advice. And so I've had to learn to keep my mouth shut and say, well, maybe you should talk to a physician or call a helpline or talk to a nurse or talk to somebody who knows about these things. I don't make psychiatric diagnoses. I might have private opinions based on my experience, but it's not my office to share that. What I know about cars is mostly from Tom and Ray Magliozzi on Car Talk. And so it's not my business to be giving car advice. Maybe could relate, what happened to me. And, that's just one example. My business is to explain the history of Christian theology as best I can, to explain church history, to explain Holy Scripture, to explain the Reformed confessions, those sorts of things. I could talk about pastoral practice and pastoral wisdom. We do on the Heidelcast and in other places. We do talk about.
We're talking about practice.
Practice,
not a game. Not a game. We're talking about practice.
But when I start straying from my areas of direct knowledge and professional expertise. Well, that's a very, very good question, R.C. It's an excellent question. And often when I do stray from my areas of expertise, when I use the authority of my office to speak to things that are beyond my competence, I make a pretty serious mistake. It's just not my business to be doing that.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
There are limits to what I'm called to do when I speak out of my office. Now, I do speak on social media about cultural things. I opine on those things. I don't speak out of my office. but just as a citizen, as a human being. And I talk about cultural things. I sometimes talk about political things, not partisan things. I try to avoid partisan politics, but I did study politics as an undergraduate, and so I have some knowledge of those things. I've been paying attention to those things for a long time, so I've done some reading on these things. So I don't feel horrible about doing that, but I don't do it from the pulpit. That's not my vocation. My vocation is to preach the Word of God when I'm in the pulpit, and I try not to do it in the classroom, maybe to illustrate something, but not to make, score partisan points. I talk about cultural issues all the time in the classroom as a way of connecting the present with the past, because not everything that we're experiencing now is brand new. Things like this have happened before, and it's the job of the historian to try to help people make those connections, I think. But there are limits to my professional competence, and there are limits to your pastor's professional competence. And that's what I'm trying to get people to recognize, the nature of the office of the minister. And I think we need to think about how it happens that we come to regard ministers as being omnicompetent. And it's not just something that happened in the Dakotas in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, where ministers came to assume in some of these small villages an oversized place in the community. It's not just there. It happens other places. I see it happening in congregations all the time. And I think, I think it happens in NAPARC churches, but most obviously it's happened in the case of John MacArthur, where he has assumed an outsized place where I'm guessing, I could be wrong, I'm happy to be corrected, but based on what I know, go look, for example, at the articles by Han Cho. He was a longtime elder, and even as I remember, on the executive committee at Grace Community Church. So in the inner circle with Dr. MacArthur's cell number, right, among the limited few that had that sort of access. And if you look at his Facebook page, did an interview, and it's linked on the Heidelblog. He did an interview with, I think it was Christianity Today, about this, that he raised questions about the way they were handling some counseling cases and some abuse cases. And as a consequence of raising those questions, as I understand things, happy to be corrected, he is no longer there. He's no longer an elder at Grace Community Church. And one of the things he was doing, in effect, implicitly, was raising questions about the limits of the competence. And Han is a lawyer by trade and had some insight into some of these issues. So take a look at those. Hohn is the first name, second name Cho. You can find his articles on the Heidelblog by going to heidelblog.net/contributors. That'd be one way to find that. You can see all the contributors, and they're all arranged alphabetically by the last name. That's what I'm trying to get you to think about is, what are the limits of a minister's competence and calling? Would you take car advice from an attorney? No, you take legal advice from an attorney. Or would you take legal advice from a physician? No, you would take medical advice from a physician. So what kind of advice should you take from a minister? Well, ecclesiastical advice, theological advice, spiritual advice, those sorts of things. But advice about how to fix your 57 Metropolitan that is stalling regularly, probably not on that list.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidelmedia production.